Okay, so once again, thank you so much for your brief and your information, and I hope that you guys gonna join them and see near the lake. And now we have Mr. Simon Rushton from University of Sheffield, and he's gonna talk about building community-level perspective into resilience policy making, insights from post-earthquake Nepal. Simon, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you. Great, and namaste, everybody. It's nice to see you all here. As you've heard, my name's Simon Rushton, and I'm going to talk to you about a project that we've been doing over the last few years in Nepal. I don't need to talk to this audience, I don't think, about the background of the earthquake in Nepal, but I'm going to talk to you about some of the work we've been doing, particularly around trying to bring in community-level voices into resilience policy-making processes in this context. It's not. Could you move it on? Great. So this project began with some work we were doing in Nepal back in 2016, 1 year after the earthquakes, which you will all remember. And we were working in some of the villages that had been affected by the earthquakes, but also talking to people at the national government level about what work the government was doing in attempting to make these kinds of communities more resilient to future disasters. And what we found was a really stark difference between the kinds of things people were talking about, the kinds of concepts and language people were using at the national policy level, very much a kind of technical, engineering-led discourse around resilience, and the kinds of concerns that people were talking to us about in communities. There seemed to be a huge gap here between what people on the ground in affected communities were talking about and the things that were being done in an attempt to benefit those people at the national level. So we started to think about how might we try to bring some of those community level perspectives, bring some of those community voices into this policy making effort. There were, at that time in Kathmandu, lots of consultants and lots of people from organisations like the World Bank and DFID and so on, helping the government of Nepal to make better resilience policy. And we were thinking about how can we bring some of these community level perspectives in. And the method we used was participatory video. And this was a method that we used in 3 villages in Nepal, 2 in Sindapulchok district and 1 in Gorkha district, for those of you who know Nepal. 3 villages which had all been badly affected by the earthquakes of 2015. And we wanted to take the voices of these communities into the policy process. So participatory video was a method by which we gathered together in each group, in each village, a group of 8 young people. We taught them how to make films, so we taught them how to handle cameras, how to use microphones. We taught them interview techniques. We taught them how to edit. We sent them out into the communities to be the researchers, to talk to their fellow community members, to interview them, to gather the community's ideas on what were the future threats that they thought they faced as a community, what were the things that they were worried about as a community, and what kinds of help, what kinds of resources, what kinds of policies did they think they needed from government to be able to better deal with those kinds of future threats. Our participants, and you can see them on the pictures here, they made all of the decisions in these films. They decided who they talked to, they decided what questions they asked. They then edited these together into a final product, and there was 2 films from each village, which they thought conveyed the kinds of messages they would want policymakers to hear from their village. So this was all about them deciding what the message was. And these are just some pictures of them in the villages making their films. And we then took our participants, the people who made the films in each village, with their films on tour around Nepal. We held workshops at all levels of government, from local government, district government, provincial governments, right up to national government. And at each of these events, participants who made the films would first present their film, and we would use that as a launching off point for a dialogue between these people from the villages and the policymakers and the policy implementers that we'd gathered together in the room. Dialogues about differences in perception about what they thought the issues were, about what they thought the risks were. I'm now hopefully going to show you just to give you a sense of what these videos look like, just a short 2-minute excerpt. If you could start the video. It should, if you move the mouse, it should appear, yeah. Okay, so sorry, we had some technical issues with the sound there, but hopefully you could at least tell from the English subtitles what those people were talking about. In the last few minutes I just want to talk through a few of the themes that came up, both in the films but also in the series of policy workshops that we held, to think about some of the key lessons that we drew from this project and this experience. I mean, one of the things we found really was some big differences between what government thinks of as disasters and what people in communities thought of as disasters. And often when we were talking to people at the community level, they would interpret disasters very much about things that happened to them in their personal lives, and not thinking about the ways in which in fora like this we were thinking about disasters. Of course, the memories of the earthquake were very fresh, and some of the villagers experienced landslides, as you saw in the film, so these kind of immediate disaster risks were very fresh in people's minds. But thinking about what future disaster risks their communities might face, much less so. But what we did find in these communities was actually a lot of concern about bigger social and economic issues, not necessarily directly connected with a potential future earthquake, whatever it might be, but nevertheless which would affect their resilience, their ability to cope with those kinds of things. And for us there's a big lesson there about resilience being more than just about engineering and more than just about making sure that people's houses don't fall down in future earthquakes, but it's also about the social fabric. And people in communities were very aware of those, very aware of concerns like outward migration, poverty, inequality, all of these things which would necessarily impact on their ability to cope with future disasters. We found, although in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, the government of Nepal had a very concerted effort to make sure that all aid went in a coordinated manner, and that seems to have worked fairly well in the immediate aftermath and in the relief period. What we found is the kind of proliferation of institutions over time in the recovery and the DRR building period, which has been very difficult for communities to understand. They have very limited knowledge, and this links into the next point, about who the institutions are responsible for delivering certain things in their communities. Very limited understanding about who they ought to go to if they feel that the needs of their communities are not being addressed. A lot of awareness of the reconstruction programme, and particularly the National Reconstruction Authority's programme for providing grants for people to reconstruct their houses. But beyond that, the wider DRR policy landscape, we found very low awareness of, but also, as the slide says, very low awareness of the institutions responsible for delivering those things. And that for us shows a really clear need for, of course, more community-level education and awareness raising, but also for a better two-level dialogue between communities and governments. And that was something which came up again and again as a theme. And many of the workshops we held with policy audiences actually became educational opportunities in which our participants could learn from the policymakers, from the policy implementers, and take that information back to their villages, which many of them did. We also found issues around policy implementation, and many occasions in the policy workshops in which things that government at whichever level thought had been done, the people in these rural villages had not seen any evidence of actually happening in their village. And for us, what this really pointed out was the need for better feedback mechanisms, for better monitoring mechanisms, for a continual dialogue between what's happening at village level and what policymakers think are being done. Lots of times we found examples of really good policy initiatives being decided at the centre, which weren't feeding through into action on the ground, but nobody at the centre knew they weren't feeding through into action on the ground. Now, our participatory video approach, I think, gave us one way of addressing this problem, but on a very small scale. Right? We could do this in 3 villages. We could talk about the experiences of those villages. But we suspect from what we found in these 3 villages that this is a nationwide problem, and the need to scale up these kinds of feedback mechanisms, to better formalise these kinds of feedback mechanisms, is really key. The last thing I wanted to talk about was about marginalised communities. So Nepal, as many of you will know, has suffered from huge inequalities in terms of caste, in terms of gender, age, many other things. And we were interested as part of this research in looking at what were the experience of the traditionally disadvantaged groups, and how was DRR policy recognising those experiences and addressing those inequalities. And we found some really interesting things that as these change through the stages, and this is what we found in the communities, very often when you talk to people in Nepal, and there's a degree of truth in this, they will talk about the natural resilience of Nepali communities, about how the culture, the sense of community means that people pull together in a crisis. And even the marginalised get the help that they need in a crisis. And we found quite a lot of evidence of that in terms of the few days after the earthquake, in terms of the immediate relief efforts, the ability of people to get access to emergency humanitarian aid materials. But as time went on, and particularly as we got into the reconstruction process, we found more and more evidence of the old inequalities reasserting themselves in that process. In terms of questions like who is able to get access to the government grants to rebuild their homes, we very often found that some of those inequalities which had preceded the earthquake continued. And this was not a policy decision that they would continue. This was often made the result of local processes during implementation. And that's something that we really found is the importance of keeping an eye on these issues through the implementation process. And we're now working on a follow-on project where we're focusing specifically on the reconstruction of people's homes and looking in the same 3 villages, using the same community filmmakers to look at who is being able to reconstruct their homes, who is receiving the government grants, but also who isn't, and who's not getting access to those, who are still living in temporary shelters. And very much we're finding in that work that the same kinds of inequalities that preceded the earthquake are still very much relevant now. So, to sum up, we use participatory video in this project as a way of trying to bring people's communities' voices into policy-making processes, to try and sensitise policymakers to what was happening at community level, to act as a feedback mechanism in terms of policy implementation questions. And we found this a really successful method for doing that. People in the villages really enjoyed being able to make these films, to know that high-level policy audiences are going to see these films, are going to hear the voice of their village. So there's a real community empowerment aspect to this project that was something that we were extremely proud of. I think we learned some important lessons, particularly about what's working well and what's working less well, that we were able to talk to policymakers about, that our participants from the villages were able to talk to policymakers about. But as I talked about earlier, this also needs to be scaled, and there is a need to think about different ways, using other methods, in which more people can be involved in these kind of processes. Thank you.